A wicked world. An angry God. A righteous man named Noah who built an ark and survived a flood. But did it happen the way the Bible describes it? While some scientists are looking for answers, others search for confirmation of the biblical account. Will they find it? Or was the story of Noah simply a story of God and man and a promise? The story of a man and a boat and a flood first appears in the Middle East, the same part of the world that gave birth to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's told in both the Bible and the Quran, the account of a catastrophic event that happened very early in human history, not too long after the creation.
In the beginning, God created everything.
Many of us learned the story when we were kids, even if we didn't go to Sunday school.
So what God decided to do was create a great flood, and the flood would wash everything away, except for one family God saw was doing very good things, and that was Noah's family.
But how seriously should we take the story of Noah and his ark? Did it happen the way the Bible tells us it did?
A lot of people doubt that there really was a flood and there was an ark, but I believe the Bible is historically true, and I believe there was a flood and there was an ark.
Was there really a worldwide flood? I doubt it. I don't see any evidence in the geology or anything else for a worldwide catastrophe.
I believe the story about the flood. Now, if you ask me, do I believe that there was a 450-foot long ark with all the animals of the earth, crammed inside of it? I'd specifically probably no.
The story of Noah and the flood is told in the book of Genesis, which is an account of the origins of earth and of man. According to the Bible, the descendants of Adam and Eve lost sight of why God put them on the earth and fell into wicked ways. So God decided to do something about it.
And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing.
Everyone and everything was going to die, except Noah and his family. But can the Bible be taken literally? Let's start with the ages of the people involved. Noah, for instance, was about 500 years old when he got the warning. And that poses a problem for many modern readers.
The age of the people mentioned in the biblical record, how old they are when they die, is an unusual problem because that's not what we see today.
But it's not an insoluble problem.
Maybe, for example, humans, when first created, were intended to live long life, but environmental changes might have come along, and all of a sudden, people began to live less length of time.
Some theologians take the biblical numbers as metaphors.
When the Bible talks about years, age, it's talking about respect. It's a culture in which age was respected. So when you assign more years to a person, you're talking about the great respect with which they're held.
Fundamentalists, on the other hand, take the Bible's description of days and years as statements of fact.
God's word can be taken literally. And in the beginning, God created in 6 days, means he created it in 6 literal 24-hour days.
The literal interpretation of the timeline given in Genesis has had a number of interesting consequences. Among them was this. It provided the basis for calculating both the date of creation and the date of Noah's flood. The person who made the calculations was a 17th century Irish archbishop named James Ussher. He started by adding the ages of 21 generations of people in the Old Testament, beginning with Adam and Eve. Using known historical dates as fixed points, and after 100 pages of calculations, he divined that the world was created in 4000 BC. To adjust for a calendar error, he put the date of creation at Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC, which fact was duly noted in the margins of some Bibles. Using the date of creation, Ussher then calculated the year of the Great Flood, 2348 BC. According to the Bible, it was roughly 100 years before that when Noah received God's instructions about how he and his family were going to survive. God told Noah to build a boat, a very big boat, an ark, and the instructions were quite specific.
The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits.
A cubit is the length of a man's arm from elbow to fingertips, about 1.5 feet. So if the Bible's dimensions are correct, it would have been the largest wooden vessel in the history of the world, the original man-made wonder. And some people apparently believe it's still out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. In the past 100 years or so, ark hunters have descended on the Middle East and climbed various mountains, looking for the peak the ark might have settled on. The Bible isn't precise about the location. We're only told the ark came to rest on the mountains, plural, of Ararat. Ararat was a region, an ancient kingdom called Urartu. Mount Ararat, singular, in eastern Turkey wasn't named until centuries after the kingdom disappeared. But that hasn't stopped it from being the archaeologist's favorite hunting ground. And there are plenty of leads to follow up. One story goes that in 1917, a Russian pilot, Vladimir Roskovitsky, thought he spotted an ark-like object on the mountain. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia sent an expedition to investigate. From there, the story gets a bit hazy. No records of an expedition have ever come to light. Roskovitsky claimed that the photos were destroyed in the revolution later that year. But it's unlikely that the expedition ever even took place. It just so happens that by 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was no longer in power. Then, in the 1950s, an apparent breakthrough. A Frenchman named Fernand Navarre brought back wood from the peak that was dated to the early Bronze Age. Interest in Mount Ararat soared, until Navarre's guide revealed that the Frenchman had not only lugged the wood down the mountain, but also up it a few months earlier. An article about an Ararat expedition sparked some interest in creationist circles in 1972. They were using it to plan their own expedition. The story had first appeared in a publication called The Sword of Gideon in 1933. It turned out the editor had adapted the story from another publication, which in turn was copied from a German article published on April 1st, 1933. That paper later confessed that the entire story had been an April Fool's Day prank. The German public enjoyed the joke, but the creationists were not amused. In ark lore, stories like these abound and may account for ark hunting's dubious reputation.
If somebody does claim to find the ark, it'll be a hoax. I'll be very, very surprised if anybody ever finds Noah's Ark.
In 1959, the discovery everyone had been waiting for hit the news. A Turkish army captain named İlhan Darupanar was poring over aerial photos of Turkey near Ararat when he spotted a small boat-like shape lying at an altitude of about 6,300 feet. Archaeologists began making the trek to the site, and sure enough, they found something. A large boat-shaped mass buried under tons of mud and ice. Hassan Bey has been living at the site, guarding it for the past 20 years.
I am the historian of Noah's Ark, Haji Hassan Bey. There is no legend about Noah's Ark being on Mount Ararat. Whatever they say, it's here. Noah's Ark is here. Americans announced it All the writings inside. They bring sheep and goat and lamb and pray and say, "Thank God Noah's Ark is with us." Of course they believe it.
One of the most persistent visitors to the site was an American fundamentalist named Ron Wyatt, who was the first to pronounce that these large carved stones found near the site had been used as anchors for the ark. The conventional explanation is that they were ceremonial stones carved by Stone Age tribesmen. In the 1980s, ark hunting got an infusion of credibility from an unlikely source, an astronaut.
One of the people that was vastly interested in Noah's boat was my late colleague and friend, James Irwin.
Jim Irwin was the 8th man to walk on the moon, the first one to drive the car on the moon, and he had an epiphany. It was a life-changing experience when he stood on the surface of the moon and he looked across the black canopy of space and he saw the Earth pulsing with life. He knew that that wasn't by accident, that a creator breathed that into existence.
And therefore, God must really have some good reason for him to be on this earth. He became very religious, and one of the things that he wanted to do was to go ahead and seek the location of Noah's boat on Mount Ararat.
He opened the door for ark searchers. He made ark searching respectable, having a great scientist like him go.
Irwin made a number of trips to Turkey, though he died before finding any conclusive evidence of the ark's existence. He would inspire a whole new generation of ark hunters, and one of them came up with a cutting-edge way of searching. The conventional ark hunter mounted an expedition and climbed a mountain. But Porcher Taylor came up with a unique approach after hearing an interesting rumor when he was a West Point cadet.
In 1973, I was on the debate team at the Academy, and one day, one of my colleagues on the debate team said, "Did you hear about the rumor ricocheting off the walls here that one of our space-based birds accidentally turned its cameras on too early, flying over Mount Ararat, coming up on the Soviet Union, and the image would appear to be a bow of a ship sticking out of a glacier?" And I said, "Geez, there really might be a ship up on Mount Ararat, and it might be the remains of Noah's Ark."
It turned out the Noah's Ark stories had been floating around the CIA since 1949, when a photo reconnaissance mission had snapped a picture of something. The CIA called it the Ararat Anomaly. It took years, but Taylor finally managed to get the photo declassified and decided to take a closer look at the boat-like shape. In 1999, he convinced a remote imaging company to point its high-resolution Iconos satellite at the Ararat Anomaly. On October 5, 1999, it captured these images.
The Iconos images showed what appeared to be really a very large Titanic-shaped structure heavily submerged in the glacial ice.
But Taylor wanted more resolution, and in February 2003, he got it, with a new digital globe satellite that could see a grapefruit from space.
This image has never been released to the public, and that in and of itself is exciting. Here, for the first time ever, we really see that this is very much a ship-shaped, boat-shaped structure from end to end. And it's 1,015 feet long. Now, what about width? Roughly 160 feet. Is there any significance to that? Yes, there is. The Genesis blueprint is 6-to-1 length-to-width ratio, 300 cubits by 50 cubits. Our ship-shaped structure here is right in the ballpark of about a 6-to-1 length-to-width ratio. We might really be on the verge of seeing something of biblical proportions on that area.
Taylor decided to show the pictures to some outside experts, including geologist Farouk El-Baz, a pioneer in interpreting satellite imagery.
When I first got the Iconos images, I knew that we'll be looking at something that's very different from the images that we had in the past. And that particular image was actually fascinating. You had a scene that's completely covered by snow, and then in one corner, there is a vertical ledge, something that is very peculiar, doesn't fit the general scheme.
But a closer, more critical look reveals something else.
These steps in here are erosional features of layered rock. This is a layer of rock, this is a second layer, this is a third layer, fourth layer, and the fifth layer, and we to continue right here. These are not necessarily man-made steps, and that's the boat, and the steps get off the boat. The more I looked at it, the more I was convinced that it really is just a ledge of rock. The rest of the area around it is covered by snow, and that little vertical face is not covered by snow because it stands up like that, and therefore it is just a normal event, a normal structure. Nothing peculiar, nothing man-made.
The only way to know for sure is to climb up to the site and look it over. But that's not likely given its remoteness.
You cannot just go there and find your way up. It is in a very steep area, and very few people will be able to scale it.
For the moment, at least, Porcher Taylor is inclined to accept Dr. Elbaz's findings.
It's not definitive as to what the anomaly might be. Based on the evidence so far, Dr. Elbaz is probably correct, that this is not a man-made structure.
But Taylor plans to keep on looking from the comfort of his armchair. But are the Ark hunters combing the mountains for a boat that might not even exist? Could Noah have really built a boat that big? Some modern shipbuilding experts have their doubts.
Noah's project is pretty unbelievable as far as the size of 450 feet dimensions and 75 feet wide. Being a boat builder, that would be a glacial task.
At the Boothbay Harbor Shipyard in Maine, it takes a 12-man crew about a year to build a wooden boat with a 60-foot keel. Every beam and plank has to be set precisely. The keel needs to be ramrod straight, but the boards forming the hull have to be curved.
This plank here was really hard to bend. It's very thick and fairly long. We cooked it for over 3 hours, and then we rush in here, and then we put levers on it and twist it into submission, you could say.
To heat the boards, modern boat builders use a steamer.
I don't think that Noah would have been steam bending wood. He would have been using much bigger timbers, and most of them would have been probably either sawn or carved to shape with edge cutting tools, that sort of thing.
Those tools, in Noah's case, would most likely have been made out of stone. And Noah would also have needed to understand something called the square cube rule, which states that strength decreases in proportion to scale.
One of the big challenges in wooden vessel construction and all types of architecture, for that matter, is that as you increase the size of a structure, the strength goes way down.
It's why elephants require heavy skeletons and hamsters don't. And the boat builders have an experiment to prove it.
What we have here is a model that is 3 feet long, and it's scaled up in a bigger model, which is 12 feet long. So every dimension on the big one has been multiplied by 4 times, including the thickness of the planking and the width of the boat, the depth of the boat, and the length of the boat. We're now going to put the small model in the water and show how it can fairly easily support the weight of this water bottle. The water bottle weighs just about what a person would weigh if that model were the full size.
And then it's time for the experiment's control phase.
This boat is 4 times in all dimensions.
Becky weighs proportionately less to the bigger model than the water bottle weighs to the smaller model.
So her weight should be less of a stress on this boat than the water bottle is. I'm not going to predict that it should hold up. You can take my weight in your hand. That was remarkable. This is not the type of construction that we're known for in the shipyard. This is only a demonstration. See, we built them good.
Looks like we need to do some repairs here. Now, don't break it.
It's clear that Noah would have faced a number of challenges, per the square cube rule. The mysterious gopher wood Noah used would have had to have been super strong. Though some fundamentalists believe Noah could have solved the problem by building a vessel that was shaped more like a barge than a boat. But the question is, could such a gigantic vessel have survived a mighty storm and a flood?
In big seas, a big boat gets working and twisting, and it can break in half. Noah's boat could have withstood a moderate storm. I wouldn't say it would survive a catastrophic storm. Boats can't even survive those now.
So what about the storm and the flood that the Bible talks about? Is there any evidence that might confirm the biblical account? Whether the Ark of Noah existed or not, some people think there are clues that point to a global flood. Of all the natural disasters that must have afflicted prehistoric people, floods seem to have left the largest imprint.
Every culture worldwide has a flood myth. It's probably the only truly universal myth that we have.
And the myth is especially prevalent in the Middle East. One story is intriguingly similar to the Noah account.
The Epic of Gilgamesh is a Mesopotamian story. It originally goes back to about the year 2700 BCE, the third millennium, in what is now modern-day Iraq. You've got one man, you've got one ark, you've got a couple birds, you've got a bunch of animals, you've got their immediate family, and you've got all of humankind being wiped out except for this one guy, his boat, and everybody on it.
The main difference between the two stories is that the biblical account emphasizes a moral dimension. Humans are punished for their sins. Could both stories have arisen from the same event?
There are enough similarities between the story in the Bible of Noah's Ark and the story in the Epic of Gilgamesh that, without a doubt, they are related.
And central to both stories is the flood.
And behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth, and everything that is in the earth shall die.
Everything, that is, except Noah and a chosen few.
But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy son's wife with thee.
But Noah and his family wouldn't be alone on the ark.
And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female.
So Noah and his family and the animals locked themselves inside the ark and waited for the promised storm to come. And they didn't have to wait long.
And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
The Bible tells us that the water rose a distance of 15 cubits, or about 22 feet, until it covered the land, even the highest hills. For 150 days, the ark rode upon the waters. But what were those waters? Where did they come from? And where did they go after the flood subsided? Over the years, many different theories have been advanced by creationists to explain how Noah's flood actually happened. One theory holds that on the third day of creation, when God created the sky and separated the seas from the land, some water got trapped under layers of earth. Under pressure, the water finally burst forth. Geysers erupted all over the earth at the same time and caused the flood. It's not a theory mainstream geologists take seriously.
You don't have to really propose what might happen if water came up from below, because we just know there's no water down there. If all the geysers erupt globally, you wouldn't really put that much water up into the planet to do anything. But it might be kind of cool, standing around in Yellowstone waiting for geysers to go off.
Another popular theory was proposed in the 1960s by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb. They believed that prior to the flood, a canopy of water vapor existed over the atmosphere. The floodwaters were brought on when this canopy of vapor somehow collapsed through an unknown mechanism. Creationists say this water vapor canopy gave us a source for at least half the water that was needed for the flood. But there are a number of problems with this theory, mainly the crushing pressure of a super dense atmosphere.
It really wouldn't be a pleasant place to live. This would be like sitting at the bottom of the deepest trench on the ocean.
One planet that has a thick vapor canopy is Venus.
Think about the kinds of pressures that exist on Venus, where space probes only last a few hours before they crumple.
Another theory of where the floodwaters came from has been developed by Bruce Massey, an archaeologist working at the Los Alamos lab in New Mexico. He thinks the flood may have been caused by something from outer space, and he thinks he's found evidence of it in myths from around the world, including in his own backyard.
Native Americans in general have a flood legend. Each group has their own sort of separate flood legend.
Those groups passed down their history orally, but elements also persisted in their art.
Petroglyphs, rock art, for example, it tells a story. It's not just meaningless doodles.
Massey is especially interested in a pictograph found throughout North and South America.
Many different Indian cultures that relate to the flood. Usually it's in association with water serpents, feathered headdress serpents.
Massey sees a common theme in the images, an elongated creature, often with a horn on its head, associated in some manner with the flood. He thinks it's likely that these horned serpents are depictions of something the rock carvers saw in the sky, something unusual, something the ancients associated with disaster, a comet.
When you look at comets, you see the tails. It looks like a headdress or a horn. Based on the mythology, it's very clear to me that we are looking at a comet hitting the ocean somewhere as the basis for the Great Flood.
He's identified a possible impact site 900 miles southeast of Madagascar. The scenario is not that far-fetched. A comet about 2 miles wide enters the solar system and takes dead aim at Earth. It plunges through the atmosphere at over 100,000 miles an hour and strikes water. That's when all hell breaks loose.
It would have shot a volume of water up maybe 9 or 10 times the mass of the comet itself, up through the atmosphere.
Such an impact would have the energy of 10 million megatons of TNT. 500 million times the energy released in the bomb that hit Nagasaki. It would eject excess water vapor into the atmosphere, causing catastrophic rain for 6 or 7 days. A massive tsunami in the Indian Ocean hitting the coasts 1,500 miles away, with waves over 600 feet high. And cyclonic storms happening all across the Earth. Water falling out of the sky would combine with the ocean storms to create catastrophic hurricanes.
So it would have appeared as if it was this huge, massive flood covering the Earth. This is also, interestingly enough, about the time that we see the last major climate change.
Massey's theory is a radical one, and he knows astronomers are dubious. But mainstream geologists can't rule it out. They see the evidence of impacts all over the Earth.
This is actually the most plausible of all theories. The fact that it would have been possibly caused by a comet's encounter with the Earth. We know that these things happen. We know that there are large craters formed because of meteorite and cometary impacts on Earth.
The Earth has been catastrophically hit since its creation, bombarded by asteroids and meteorites. One impact probably caused the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and impacts still happen today.
The catastrophic event would probably leave a lasting impact on the culture's sort of oral traditions, such that you'd hear about it 5,000 years later in the form of some story.
An event like that would have certainly created myths. People would have had to explain it. They would have to tell succeeding generations that this awful thing happened and to let people know.
But what exactly were they describing? A flood that covered the whole earth. That's what the Bible tells us happened in the story of Noah. But most geologists can't find any evidence to support such a theory.
We really don't know if there's been any point in the Earth's history where the planet was completely covered by water.
Conventional geology does assert that the Earth was almost entirely covered by water about 500 million years ago, when the climate was much warmer than it is now. That's when many of the marine fossils we find on mountaintops today were deposited. At least that's what most geologists believe. But not those who regard the Bible as the supreme authority. For the past 20 years, Tom Vail has led rafting tours of the Grand Canyon from a fundamentalist Christian perspective.
Back in 1980, I took a vacation rafting in Grand Canyon and just fell in love with the place. And 2 years later, I quit my corporate job and became a full-time rafting guide. We bring people to the canyon and show it to them from a biblical worldview, and how the evidence that we see here in the canyon supports and upholds the authority of the Word of God.
Vail is part of a movement that's challenging the scientific orthodoxy that the Earth is billions of years old, though that's what he used to believe.
When I first came to the canyon, I was an evolutionist and believed in the millions of years and taught that for about 15 years.
But he began to question the old Earth model.
The big difference between the two models, the old Earth and the young Earth, are really time. Was it 6 days or millions of years? I'll subscribe to what the Word of God says and take the 6 days.
To Vail, the Grand Canyon is a laboratory that proves the Earth was created in the last few thousand years and then blanketed by a worldwide flood. And the evidence is in the rocks.
The Grand Canyon exposes more sedimentary layers than I think anywhere else in the world. And we see here lots of evidence that points to the fact that the canyon was carved catastrophically.
Vail makes frequent stops along the river to point out the evidence.
The peat sandstone was laid down horizontally, but right at the fault line turns vertical.
To Vail, the folds in the layers of sediment are a dead giveaway that they were wet and malleable when they were bent.
And if this material was hard rock at the time, then it would have cracked. But being flood deposits, this material would have still been moist. So when the shifting of the fault happens, the sandstone is still somewhat fluid, and it can move and shift and create this folding.
Not surprisingly, most of Vail's colleagues disagree with his interpretation.
If the canyon was cut relatively quickly out of soft muds, we wouldn't expect the canyon to have the large sort of bends in it that we see. The canyon would be straight. The bending U-shape that you see is very indicative of a slow erosional process.
Another point of contention is what the fossil layers reveal.
Marine fossils are buried throughout the layers, and they're not buried in any kind of homogeneous way. They've been scattered, moved around, and broken.
If all the fossils on the planet were caused by a flood, we'd expect them to all be very uniform globally, and we don't find that uniformity.
There is one thing the creationists and the evolutionists agree on, that the canyon was carved by water.
The fact that the rocks of the Grand Canyon are largely laid down by water doesn't mean that the entire planet at some point in its history was covered by a giant flood.
All the evidence that we see here in the Grand Canyon, if you look at it with an open mind, points to a global flood. This was the flood of Noah's day.
It's absolutely ridiculous to suggest that the Grand Canyon was caused by a global flood. The Bible is not a history book. It's not a geology textbook.
The Bible is like a person, and if you torture it long enough, you can get it to say almost anything you'd like it to say. But it's not a science book.
In the Bible story, Noah can see nothing but water once the storms abate.
And it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made.
Noah sent a dove to scout the earth 3 different times. The 3rd time, the dove didn't return, so Noah knew the earth was now safe for habitation. And if the Bible story is right, Noah stepped off the ark onto land he'd never seen before, up in the mountains somewhere. But which mountains? Bob Cornuke thinks people have been looking in the wrong place.
I don't believe the Ark is on Mount Ararat in Turkey. I've flown around it in a helicopter twice, fixed-wings airplane. I've been over there on horseback and hiked all over the mountain, and I've never seen anything that even looks remotely like Noah's Ark.
And the right place?
I think the real mountains of Ararat should be located in the northern mountains of Iran.
Cornuke has mounted 4 expeditions to Iran while taking the typical abuse an Ark hunter gets.
You do receive a lot of ridicule when you look for Noah's Ark. When you tell some people you look for Noah's Ark, they look at you like you wrapped tinfoil around your head and look for the mothership.
But Cornuke thinks he's got a lead no one else has been able to follow up. The report of an American engineer who saw something strange on a mountain in Iran back in 1943.
I went over there on foot and hiked up the mountain, and it was a pretty arduous climb, but when we got up about to 12,500 feet, we looked across this valley and we saw this incredible blackened object that was sticking out of the side of the mountain. It wasn't a big box shape like you'd think Noah's Ark would look like. It looked like a big building that had burned, and we had these charred remnants.
The material looked like wood, but it was so heavy only very small samples could be brought down for testing, which proved inconclusive.
I think what we saw could be Noah's Ark. I think it's a remote possibility. We need to go up there again, bring down the bigger pieces of that, what looks like wood stone, and have it properly tested.
Cornuke is waiting for results, but knows that they may not prove anything or convince anyone.
If someone really did find Noah's Ark and drug it down to downtown New York, no one would believe. It's an unprovable hypothesis. Noah didn't leave his fingerprints or a signature saying Noah's Ark was here, so it's one of those things that's probably impossible to prove.
A water vapor canopy that somehow collapses. Fountains of the deep that somehow erupt. A massive comet strikes somewhere in the ocean. All these theories offer explanations for a catastrophic flood, some more reasonable than others. But there's one final theory to explore, and it might be the most reasonable of all. For years, archaeologists have looked for evidence of a catastrophic flood somewhere in the Middle East, something that might confirm the Genesis account of Noah and his ark. And for years, they came up empty. Then, in the 1920s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley found a thick layer of silt while he was excavating the ancient city of Ur in modern-day Iraq. Surely this was evidence of a massive flood, and not so coincidentally, confirmation of the story in the Bible. But it turned out to be a false alarm.
One of the sites in Mesopotamia that Sir Leonard Woolley excavated, he thought he had found evidence of the flood, and it was announced in all the papers at that time. It turns out what he had indeed found a flood, but it was a localized flood. But it was drastic enough that there was some 3 feet of debris that wiped out the town at that time.
Subsequent searches for evidence of a flood were just as fruitless. Then, in 1996, 2 geologists were working off the coast of Turkey in one of the most mysterious bodies of water in the world. A huge saltwater sea about 750 miles across from east to west. The Black Sea. Bill Ryan and Walter Pittman were mapping the Black Sea's underwater topography when they noticed something curious. Beaches, hundreds of feet below the surface. That meant the water levels had been much lower in the past.
We found a whole number of beaches because as the water body shrank under evaporation in the very arid conditions of the Ice Age, it would leave old shorelines like bathtub rings. And so we found them at 90 meters, 110 meters. Our deepest shoreline was amazing. It was 156 meters.
Core samples of the seabed showed that at some point in its history, the Black Sea had been a freshwater lake. The core samples also showed an abrupt transition from freshwater clams to the marine kind, and carbon dating provided a date.
And the results were stunning, that the marine mollusks all seem to have appeared at all depths in the Black Sea at the same time, 7,600 years ago. So something big had happened there.
What had happened was a flood of biblical proportions, and it probably happened because of global warming. At the end of the last ice age, millions of tons of water were locked up in polar ice. But as glaciers retreated and polar ice melted, sea levels rose. That included the Mediterranean. Its rising waters looked for a place to go and found it on the other side of a thin isthmus of land where a huge freshwater lake sat waiting in low-lying ground. That could only mean one thing: the law of gravity was about to take over. Water from the Mediterranean started to cut a channel through the Bosporus, seeking lower ground. Once the channel was established, the pent-up waters in the Mediterranean broke through, wiping out everything in its path.
As it cut, it made a channel that was progressively deeper and deeper and deeper, and the deeper it got, the faster it flowed. And it probably took, I would estimate, anywhere from 30 to 90 days to cut a full-fledged, roaring flume.
And the question was anyone around to experience such an earth-shattering event? Archaeologist Fred Hebert thinks the answer is yes.
Back about 10,000 years ago, when there was no Bosphorus and the Black Sea was still a freshwater lake, its level was hundreds of feet lower than it is today.
That means a huge area around it would have been dry land.
It would have been wonderful areas for either hunter-gatherers or early agriculturalists to live. There's no reason that people wouldn't have lived there.
Those Neolithic people would have experienced something almost incomprehensible to them. One sea emptying into another through a gap several miles wide.
The people would have detected is the noise. The ground probably would have shaken. And that they probably would have felt for 100, maybe 200 kilometers. An incredible amount of energy was being released. Just an incredible amount of energy.
As the water surged through the Bosporus at 60 miles an hour, it unleashed a volume of water 200 times that of Niagara Falls. Anyone living within a few miles of the Bosporus would have been swept away. And those at a greater distance would have seen their world transformed by a flow of water that seemed to be endless.
If you're living in a river valley, you would have had to move inland anywhere from a few hundred meters to a kilometer every day, day after day after day after day, on and on and on, every day moving inland in front of this flood.
If Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis is correct, nearly 5,000 years passed between the time of the Great Flood and the time the distant memories of it would have been written down.
It certainly would have been a devastating flood that would have covered everything and everybody, and is probably the cause for the legend of the floods.
Such a catastrophic event would seem like it was encompassing the whole world. The people would have taken the stories with them as they migrated, and those stories perhaps became the Mesopotamian flood legends, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and eventually the story of Noah.
It must have been a flood, a very large one. Not necessarily one that will cover the whole earth, but that covers the vast majority of the land. They knew about it then.
And in the hands of the ancient Israelites, the story would have inevitably acquired a moral dimension. In the Bible, the story ends with a show of gratitude from Noah. and a promise from God.
And Noah built an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor. And the Lord said, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, neither will I again smite everything living as I have done.
And to remind Noah and his children of this promise, God offered a natural wonder.
Rainbow. Beautiful, yes. And whenever you see a rainbow, you can say, that's God's sign, and there will be no more floods.
And so the story of Noah and his ark gets passed on from one generation to the next, just as it's been done for the last few thousand years.
And they lived happily ever after.
And that's the other thing about Noah and his ark. Everyone gets to have his own interpretation about who he was and what the story means.
I believe that things like that could have happened, and I also believe that none of these stories comes out of thin air.
It's a story that helps us to make sense out of our human experience, and that's why it's still powerful.
The Bible can be trusted right from the very first of Genesis all the way through Revelation. You know, it starts off with truth and it ends with truth.
I see Noah as a genuine person who lived a long time ago, a person who's experienced things that we may feel like we're experiencing, and still he was a survivor, and we can be a survivor as well.
Whether or not we have scientific evidence for it, that's okay, because we can believe in it emotionally.
In the end, the story of Noah and his ark and a flood lives on for a reason.
It speaks to us. If it ceased to speak, we would cease to listen.